to this webinar hosted by MED and co-organized with RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute based in London. Today we're going to be talking about Europe and the wars in the Middle East. What's room for diplomacy? I'm delighted to be able to chair this panel today with a distinguished group of experts who have a range of specialisms on this subject, and we're going to try to cover as much ground as possible, both in terms of geographies and themes that are relevant to this conversation today. My name is Dr. Burcu Özçelik. I'm the Senior Research Fellow for Middle East and North Africa Security here at RUSI. We're joined today by Dr. Hugh Lovett. He is a Senior Policy Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. His research is focused extensively on regional geopolitics and has advised European policymakers on the conflicts in Israel, Palestine, and Western Sahara. With us also is Antonio Misiroli. He was the adjunct professor at the School of Advanced International Security Studies in Europe. He holds the position of a non-resident associate fellow at the NATO Defense College in Rome. And he was formerly a NATO Assistant Secretary General for Emergent Security Challenges. We also have Katarzyna Sidlo, who joins us from Paris. She is the Senior Policy Fellow at the European Union Institute for Security Studies, specializing in Middle East and North Africa. And finally, last but not least, we have Intissar Fakir joining us. He was a Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute, where she focuses on the geopolitics of North Africa and the Sahel. Her work has explored the intersection of political, social, and economic trends at both the national and regional levels. So I'm delighted to have you on with us today and to be a part of this conversation. Thank you very much in advance. I'm going to start, if I may, with Antonio, if I can turn to you. We're going to have 2 rounds of questions, 1 question at a time. And Antonio, if we could start by perhaps commenting on any thoughts on the outcome of the recent NATO summit, but I suspect you'll speak more directly to the European response to the recent conflict between Iran and Israel. And particularly, if you could comment on also what the conflicts in Gaza and the Israel-Iran war might reveal about Europe's alignment with US policy in the region. The floor is yours. You have about 5 minutes.
Well, the NATO summit was short and sharp and was dominated by 2 issues. One was already on the agenda, the 5% solution for defense spending, and the other one was not, notably the recent American intervention against Iran in the Middle East. I would say that on both counts, President Trump claimed a big success, claimed victory over defense spending, and also reaped a lot of support, in part also unexpected from Europeans, for the US action in Iran. Actually, the Middle East proper is not always an important issue inside NATO in NATO deliberations, in part because it is an out of area, and in part, and perhaps especially because it is highly divisive. You may remember at the time of the Iraq war, NATO was completely incapable of acting because of the divisions among allies over that. At the same time, of course, a country like Turkey invoked Article 5, that is the consultation mechanism, on a number of occasions because of what was happening in Iraq or Syria, for that matter, and in particular countries on the southern flank of the alliance very often claim that it should be paid more attention and there should be a 360 degrees approach to security by the alliance. In general, I think that the support for the Iran action was above expectations, and probably was also due to the fact that Iran had sided with Russia and has contributed to the Russian aggression against Ukraine, thus cementing additional hostility vis-à-vis the regime in Tehran. On the other hand, as far in particular as Gaza is concerned, I would say that there was widespread governmental support for the initial Israeli reaction. There has been less public opinion support, I would say, beyond governments for what has been going on over the past couple of years in Gaza. And there is in general across both issues, both Iran and Israel and Palestine, a widespread concern among Europeans about humanitarian dimension in Gaza, but also the diplomatic situation. Europe has been basically sidelined and marginalized both in the Middle East peace process, and still until a generation ago, 20 years ago, it was an important player, especially on the Palestinian Authority side, and also from the Iran file. You may remember the JCPOA was one of the big success stories of EU diplomacy, and recently the Europeans have been completely out of the picture. So there is concern about the follow-up, about the humanitarian situation, the possibility also that Iran, in the event of regime change, could degenerate into a Syria or Libya type situation, and of course concern over the future of nuclear non-proliferation after what has happened in Iran, because of course anything can still happen in that particular respect.
Thanks for that, Antonio. If we can turn to Katarzyna, and I think we'll build upon some of the comments that Antonio made, particularly on EU or European marginalization on these topics that are related to the Middle East, and particularly the Iran file. But more specifically, if you could comment on the extent to which internal divisions among member states constrain a unified European response on both Gaza and what we've seen in the Israel-Iran confrontation, and what this says more broadly about challenges in the EU's foreign and security policy apparatus. Thank you.
Thank you, Burcu. And thank you for inviting me to this conversation. So indeed, EU has been sidelined in the recent diplomatic efforts broadly in the Middle East, and to a large extent, the internal divisions have been a major constraint when it comes to the agility and effectiveness of the EU foreign policy. And this, of course, stems from the kind of structure of the EU and the way that the decisions are being made, not just on this particular file. In general, the qualified majority voting is applied in the EU, which means that not everyone has to agree to certain decisions, not all the member states. But when it comes to the common foreign and security policy, unanimity is required. And this has been the case when it comes to not just Israel and Gaza, but also obviously the Israel-Iran conflict. More broadly, there's no really big appetite or a big potential for changing of those rules, because in order to change, switch from unanimity voting into qualified majority, you would need unanimity, basically. So that's a major difficulty in terms of like how going forward, the EU could make its own policy making more agile and impactful. In some ways, however, perhaps there is a silver lining to this. There is an advantage in that while some other actors are making very quick unilateral decisions made by an individual within the EU, the process might be slower. But in the long term, there is this potential, if used well, for kind of more stable impact long term, even if the processes take very long, but it's definitely a more balanced consensus-based policy-making style, perhaps not best suited for the current geopolitical situation, though.
Thank you for that, and especially noteworthy, I think, is your point about possible silver lining being in the value of multilateral platforms, and in which is we seem to be in a geopolitical moment where that is overlooked and decisions are being made at great pace, but with mixed outcomes, to say the least. Hugh, if we could turn to you now, and ask you to look at, I know you specialize most directly in the Israel-Palestine conflict. If you could look at the European Union's historical engagement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and particularly focus on what you think has worked. Are there specific policy tools, diplomatic initiatives, or moments of leverage that Europe has successfully used? And what lessons can be drawn from these, particularly for the current moment and the impasse as we sort of wait and hope for a ceasefire announcement in Gaza?
Certainly. Actually, I think it would be easy to say what has not worked before answering your question, because the EU has tried basically everything apart from coercive leverage with Israel. In the early 2000s, it was very much preoccupied with this idea of like more for more as part of its broader European neighborhood policy. This idea of positive conditionality, so that the more that EU partners do around the Mediterranean, the more the EU will offer them. And in the case of Israel, this led to the association agreement. This led to a lot of other important deliverables for Israel, its social, cultural, scientific, and economic integration into the EU. That quite clearly failed to moderate Israeli policies towards the Palestinians and push Israel into a final peace agreement based on a two-state solution. I think that more generally, that concept of more for more is now basically dead and no longer really exists in the EU's jargon. The EU has also tried, linked to this idea of engagement. So this idea that it's important that Israel listens to us. And so for Israel to listen, we should not rock the boat with it. So we've seen over probably 2 decades, these repeated EU and European concerns with Israeli actions. But this has never really led to any actual EU retaliation or measures to actually stop those issues that the EU was itself concerned with and identified. So to be more specific, you could go back to like 2014, and the EU expressed once again its concern with Israeli actions with regards to settlement building around E1, the so-called E1 Ma'ale Adumim area. It also expressed concern over Givat Hamatos, etc., like these settlement construction in areas that were considered to be critical to the viability of a two-state solution. And to the EU's credit, in 2014, it did talk about potential red lines, and it talked about potential measures that it could take if Israel would build in these areas. And this was leaked in Haaretz and became known as the Red Lines document. And what's amazing is not just that the EU never lived up to those red lines and actually enforced them. I don't think really, hindsight, anyone really thought they would, but just how little impunity Israel has had for violating those red lines. And so fast forward 11 years, Israel has advanced construction in Givat Hamatos, Har Homa. It is now moving to advanced construction in E1 to evict Bedouin communities in Khan al-Ahmar. It is also moving forward its annexation. And again, the EU remains silent. So, and I'll finish on this point, which is before finally answering your question. Again, this logic of wanting to engage with Israel continues to this day. There was an association council meeting in, I believe it was February 2025. And the EU said it would use this to communicate strong messages to Israel about the need to maintain the Gaza ceasefire that had been reached the previous month, the need to actually increase humanitarian access to Gaza, etc., etc. 1 month later, Israel abandoned the ceasefire agreement, returned to war, cut off aid, etc., etc. So I think, again, it's clear that this EU policy of engagement has not worked. And again, the EU continues to stand by this failed policy. So in the current discussions about potentially suspending the association agreement with Israel over the EU's recognition that Israel has violated its human rights obligations under that agreement, even now some member states still say, actually, it's much better if we engage with Israel to try to get it to increase aid rather than confronting it more directly. So this was a long litany, but I think it's important just to be able to point out and to explain just how persistent the EU's failure has been in this regard over decades. Now, in the minute I have left, obviously, the conclusion I take is that the road less traveled when it comes to EU-Israel relations has been to try to promote accountability and some cost for Israeli actions, be they in Gaza or the West Bank. I think the EU itself and European countries more generally need to make this their own political journey to actually recognizing that a more robust approach to Israel is actually ultimately in Europe's own interests. And I think if they make that logical and strategic shifts in their own mindsets, then they realize there's a lot of tools that they can do. By themselves, it will not end the occupation, but it will actually be a badly needed contribution towards changing Israeli cost-benefit calculations and finally demonstrating that the EU can live up to its own aspirations to be a political or geopolitical actor, especially when it comes to the Middle East.
Thanks, Hugh, for that. And as expected, or as I expected, you flipped the question around. Inevitably, in terms of what has not worked, leading up to what may possibly work. And I think in the second round, if you could touch upon the issue of recognition and what European recognition of Palestinian statehood might mean in terms of either opening up space, much needed space for diplomacy, or could that backfire in ways that are difficult to predict in terms of the overall policy of engagement or not with Israel. But we'll turn now to Intissar. I'm very excited to have you on the panel, and thank you so much for joining us. I think your remarks will help us zoom out a little from the specifics of the Iran-Israel and what's going on in Gaza. Because you specialize in North Africa more directly and the Sahel. If you could comment on some of the key but overlooked developments impacting the wider region, North Africa and the Sahel, as our policy attention and our gaze has rightly, justifiably, of course, been focused on the Israel. The wars in the Middle East since the 7th of October attacks. Over to you.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Burcu. Look, it's first of all, it's great to be able to kind of widen the lens a little bit. I think, from Libya to Western Sahara, we see, states that are dealing with similar patterns, be it external actors competing in fractured states, sovereignty being leveraged in transactional diplomacy, and of course the shifting incentives around legitimacy and governance. So, I think it's kind of similar issues, but potentially quieter areas and contexts to deal with them. Still consequential, I think. So it's important to kind of look at some of these openings. So let me just do maybe a quick tour d'horizon, if you will allow me. I think there are a number of overlooked issues that could provide ample opportunity for diplomatic engagements on the EU side. There's the Morocco-Algeria tension and the Western Sahara issue. Of course, the ongoing tension complicates any efforts between Morocco and Algeria to resolve the issue at the UN, or even to broker a ceasefire between the Polisario and Morocco. Of course, the issue has kind of bled back to a let's say a low-level conflict since 2020. We also see, while the situation between Morocco and Algeria remains very tense, and the Western Sahara issue remains unresolved, we see the broader Maghreb region becoming more polarized and divided, of course. And I think we kind of see that playing out in potential areas where you might see shared initiatives that would benefit everybody really become areas of competition between the two, and who can be the more dominant pole to lead the Maghreb, so to speak. At the same time, on the Western Sahara specifically, of course, Morocco continues to win diplomatic recognition on a bilateral level. We saw from a number of European countries, France, UK, and all of this is sort of feeding a sort of, let's say, diplomatic arms race, where each side is really sort of doubling down on their own narrative of legitimacy and leadership. So that's just one of the potential issues. There is a number of others. There's Tunisia's economic and political trajectory, which is, both worrying and has kind of been both a challenge, but also a potential opportunity for EU diplomacy. I mean, Tunisia is one of the areas where we see kind of ongoing political regression being a serious concern. But of course, hardline pressure from the EU, or really not actually from the EU, from outside, hasn't really worked. But I think there is potential to try to sort of find some kind of targeted frameworks that reward tangible steps. For example, reopening of civil society space, improving budget transparency, potentially even supporting areas like private sector growth and so on, especially in a context of a stalled IMF deal and some, Gulf hesitancy. I think there really is room there for the EU to engage more positively. And of course, the bigger issue of North Africa is Libya and Libya's governance fragmentation. I think we saw just the extent of the, let's say, really kind of global failure to actually address this issue. But I think we are now at a point where, we see the repeated clashes that happened in May kind of remind us again of how untenable the situation is in Libya and just how fragile it is. And again, here I would say maybe we are potentially at a moment where some degree of technical diplomacy might offer some entry points, potentially for EU engagement. I say EU engagement because the EU has, let's say, less baggage than other actors in Libya, but there's certainly a big need there for European engagement.
Thank you for that, and thank you also for bringing up both the overlooked but ongoing perpetual drivers of conflict in Libya and the possibility of diplomacy there. We have been speaking about sort of Libya and Syria more recently in the context of whether political change or regime change in Iran might follow in the same footsteps of the sort of fragmentation and persistent levels of instability in Libya. But it's important to reiterate the contextual differences, the various sort of evolutionary processes of these conflicts, the ripeness of these conflicts, and their differences across Libya, Syria, and why Iran might not look like these cases ultimately in how the political situation there evolves. But I'm particularly interested in the question of recognition as a potential tool of diplomacy when it comes to Western Sahara. Of course, the UK recently took the step to endorse Morocco's plan for Western Sahara. So I might ask you to revisit this question in our next round. But thank you very much for that. And Antonio, if we could come back to you both, I suppose, to pick up on any of the strands that our other speakers have pointed to in their remarks. But more broadly, if you could comment on some of the most pressing security challenges that you identify for Europe stemming from the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East. And if you could talk about, beyond the immediate threat of ongoing instability, how concerned should European policymakers be about the threat of asymmetric warfare, cyber vulnerabilities, and counterterrorism efforts if there was a spillover from beyond the Middle East?
I think there are two main issues at play here. The first one is, of course, the risk of a sort of meltdown, turmoil in the Middle East, if not regime change, the possibility of turmoil, civil war in Iran, the consequence that would have regionally. My understanding is that the Iranian-Turkish border is already under stress, flows of migrants and refugees. I mean, in the previous cases of Libya and Syria, of course, there were immediate repercussions across Europe. from what was happening in the country, even more so in the event of involving Iran, which is a 90 million people country. Libya was only few million people. So, I mean, there is an order of magnitude of the repercussions that could be quite important. Perhaps the risk of terrorism is a little bit more under control at this stage, at least for the foreseeable future. But I think that the idea of an unregulated, turmoil-ridden Middle East is a major concern for Europeans. The second one is, how could I put it? Diplomatic influence. I mean, the Europeans are suffering from larger power shifts in and around the region. When peace or ceasefire negotiations take place in Doha or Riyadh, rather than Geneva, Vienna, or even Oslo. Of course, it is also visually evident that the European Union has lost clout, has lost control over the process. There are other actors that matter much more. There could even be a deliberate effort on the part of the American administration right now to keep the Europeans out. And of course, losing control and losing clout has also domestic repercussions. These are divisive issues, in particular the Israeli-Palestinian one, as reflected also in the ongoing debates inside the European Union. You have a group of countries that are pushing, even as you mentioned yourself, for a recognition of Palestinian state, Spain, Ireland, Slovenia, the Nordics potentially, and other countries that instead are staunch opponents of that option. The internal consensus inside the EU has already eroded over the past few years. Take the issue of the status of Jerusalem as a capital of Israel. A few countries have already broken ranks. So there is also a concern, which is not immediately a security concern, but is a concern about the credibility of the external action and image of the European Union, about internal unity. And even the ongoing discussions over the EU-Israeli agreement reflect that. And I think we will have to watch this situation very closely, because there could be sudden changes over the next few days, even in this respect.
Are you still there? Yes. If we could, in terms of comparing notes across different conflict theaters, lessons learned from the Russia-Ukraine war that can be applied to strengthen European Union engagement in the Middle East. So if we could get your thoughts on this, and to what extent can the European Union leverage potentially diplomatic tools such as trade policy, or deploy it's within its sanctions toolbox to create a mix of incentives and pressure points to create pathways to conflict resolution, or whether that looks more like containment. And this would be in reference to, of course, Israel-Gaza, but if you wanted to refer to possibilities, pathways in Syria or Iran as well, if you're happy to speak to those cases.
Right, thank you very much. I do think it's a very good question, because it's important to draw lessons learned from other conflicts, and in particular the Russia-Ukraine war. And I think there's really a couple of takeaways that we can take and then apply to the current situation very broadly in the Middle East, but also beyond. And the first one I would say is that what we've seen, the change between the EU reaction between 2022, 2013, is really questioning some conventional truths that's been around. And the first one was that Russia just took part of the territory of Ukraine, and it's not really a big threat to the EU. So that was kind of the prevalent narrative in majority of the member states and within the EU back in 2014. And then with time, that proved not to be true. Then the second one is that, just talking about those conventional truths, was that it would be very difficult to directly challenge Russia on its actions in Ukraine because of how dependent EU has been on Russia's energy imports. And we also seen that despite the price that, of course, had to be paid, by the the markets, the consumers when it comes to the energy price, it's been possible to use the economic statecraft to try to attempt to shape the outcomes of the Russian-Ukraine war. Now, of course, the sanctions, and we've had already 17 packages of sanctions, and the EU is close to adopting the 18th one. And we have some mixed results, of course. It didn't lead to a complete cessation of the fighting, but most definitely there's been an impact on Russia's behavior and on Russian economy. But that points me to another lesson learned, that for any tools like sanctions to work, there's a need for kind of more global coalition, because otherwise you have a situation where the EU is imposing sanctions and Russia is able to a certain extent circumvent them. So in order to build like a really strong case, make a really strong case for sanctions, you really need partners and you need coalition. So for the Middle East, that would probably translate into talking closer to the partners in the Gulf when it comes to common goals, when it comes to maintaining regional stability. Now, another lesson learned, I would say that that the progress that the EU has made in terms of using this economic statecraft in the Russian-Ukraine war is that even in cases where you don't have full unanimity, and we know we don't among all the member states, even on the Russian file, there is a possibility to find solutions. So that's why I'm saying it takes time. It is a complicated process, but it is possible to, in the end, find solutions that are agreeable to the member states and presented as the broad EU policy, as has been the case when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. Again, despite the fact that still not all member states are always on the same page when it comes to the sanctions, and we've seen recently with the 18th package. So what very shortly, what does it tell us about the situation in the Middle East? So I will perhaps use the Syrian case just to highlight some things. One would be, again, this need for collaboration with other partners. Here with the Gulf states, with Turkey as well, just making regional coalitions to find common ground and find common goals. Any kind of both incentives and pressure work best when they are applied in a coalition. Of course, the EU doesn't have the same instruments as the US does, for instance, in terms of secondary sanctions. But the EU sanctions relief, which was the EU did it first before the US decided to do it, it perhaps didn't have that big of an economic impact, but it definitely sent a strong political signal that there is this benefit of the doubt given to the new Syrian government. Now that the US lifted, or is in the process of lifting sanctions, and the EU lifted sanctions, well, this is the time to first of all focus on both in further incentives for the change in terms of the governance issues in Syria, but also in terms of pressures, as in having more concrete lines. What would have to happen for the certain sanctions to be reimposed again? The EU has been stressing that the sanctions were relieved, but they are revocable. So I think another lesson learned from the Russian file is that there's a need for kind of more concrete messaging. And again, this is something where it would be ideal to agree on with other partners for this to be more persistent across the board.
Thank you very much for that, and especially for bringing in the issue of Syria, where we're seeing early signs, but positive signs of improvement, particularly on the sanctions relief front, of course, historic steps that were taken during Trump's visit to the Gulf and the announcement in Saudi Arabia. Hugh, if I can come back to you and ask the same question, but perhaps phrase it slightly differently. In terms of what more should the EU be doing? What is realistically possible given internal disputes, fragmentation, and the need, of course, for consensus in order to effect actual change, particularly on the question of engagement with Israel? But is there space for Europe to be an effective actor where we are right now? And if so, hoping that the answer is yes, where should it concentrate its political capital?
The EU, and I should say its member states, have a large menu of options. And so this is not a question, this is not a crisis of leverage. It is a crisis of political willingness to use that leverage, to use those EU and European tools. And the way I would understand it is what's the theory of change? What do we want to do with our tools? Beyond the general objective of reaching a two-state solution. I think the first aim, as I talked about in my first intervention, is to change Israeli calculations, be it the calculation of the Israeli government, the broader Israeli political system, or the Israeli public itself. And how does the EU ensure that it is not contributing or enabling or encouraging Israel's unlawful actions in the West Bank and Gaza? I think there's a menu of actions that can be taken against the settlements, including first and foremost the need to ban Israeli settlement products and financial services, which the EU continues to shy away from. There are now 9 member states that want to move forward with this, and Ireland is moving forward to implement this, at least at a national level. There are also actions that could be taken against Israel itself in the context of the association agreement. And we talked a little bit about that and how that can be done with a qualified majority vote. And I think on this point, what's important to say is, yes, the EU is divided. Yes, this divisions can limit the scope of what the EU can do. But I think sometimes it's an excuse for the EU to not do anything. Actually, you can do far more through this QMV, qualified majority voting system. And indeed, the Commission itself could do much more to be proposing options. The Commission did not need to be asked by the member states to conduct a review into Israel's compliance of Article 2 in the association agreement. It could have done that itself and already proposed options to be taken by the member states. The Commission itself could already be proposing to ban settlement trade and financial services. So it's also, I think, an issue within the Commission and the political unwillingness of President von der Leyen to actually move down this path that is also problematic. And of course, member states themselves can come together to take action within so-called coalitions that are like-minded. So this basket, I think the first basket is what can be done against the settlements in Israel, and there's a lot more that can be done. Now, the second basket, to pick up on your question previously about recognition, is what can be done to advance Palestinian self-determination and strengthen Palestinian sovereignty within the occupied Palestinian territory, Gaza, and the West Bank. And again, here, there's a lot that can be done. We won't go into all of it, but the EU does have important tools. And I think recognition is extremely important. Yes, in some ways it's symbolic, but it would be sending an important message that the question of Palestinian statehood is already settled, despite the ongoing occupation, that the question of Palestinian statehood should not be seen as controversial or something to be negotiated over, that Palestinian self-determination should not continue to be vetoed by Israel, that this is a done matter. And I think already 140 countries have already recognized the state of Palestine, including, I think, about 8 member states. You mentioned some of them, but including also countries that are considered to be blockers, like the Hungarians. Hungary also recognized the state of Palestine before becoming an EU member. So actually, I think the trend is towards recognizing Palestinian rights and self-determination, and now it's a question about whether the French, the Brits, the Italians actually catch up with the rest of the international community, and then how you build on that to strengthen sovereignty in practice. And finally, and to come back to what Katarzyna was saying, this is also about multilateralism and how the EU, how European countries can continue to strengthen their engagement with Arab countries, especially Gulf monarchies, to further joint objectives such as implementing a two-state solution. There's still aspirations to hold a joint or to hold a UN conference in New York on this question, co-hosted by Saudi Arabia and France. I think this is also an important moment, not just symbolically, but also to start to take practical measures to implement this, and also engage the American administration on the importance of moving down this route. And my final word is, the EU should not be doing this just for the sake of Palestinians or morality. This is ultimately in the EU's own interest to be no longer self-marginalizing, to be seen as a credible political actor and an actor that actually stands up in support of its own self-declared principles and objectives, be it implementing a two-state solution, but also more broadly defending the rules-based order, whether against Russian aggression in Ukraine or against Israeli actions, annexation in the West Bank, and ethnic cleansing in Gaza.
Thanks for that, Hugh. Very comprehensive and a lot to unpack there, particularly as there seems to be some momentum, unconfirmed reports about progress on a potential ceasefire deal or hostage release in Gaza. And so many questions around what that might look like in terms of post-war governance structures in Gaza and how that might integrate European influence alongside Middle East, particularly Gulf states, in a more comprehensive or multilateral format during this process of transition. But finally, Intissar, if we can come back to you, please, and any additional remarks that you'd like to make on what our other speakers have commented on. And one of the questions I wanted to pose to you was on migration dynamics between the Sahel and Europe, which is an oft-spoken about policy issue, or whether you wanted to comment on the recent developments around Morocco's Western Sahara plan and the greater bid there for potential for European diplomatic cooperation. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe I'll try to touch very quickly on both, but I want to pick up where you left off with your caveat about sort of how very different the political evolutions and contexts in each one of these different countries are. And I want to be very clear, I'm not talking about North Africa conflicts as sort of being a blueprint here for the region. I think it's important, obviously, to recognize that. But I think there's also sort of a sense in which looking at these conflicts can kind of help us expand the realm of the possible, right? As we look at how the conflicts kind of play out, but also what is the realm of possibility in front of states as they try to adapt? How could fragmentation potentially be managed? What does sort of sovereignty bargaining, what is the realm of sovereignty bargaining look like? And even kind of, diplomatic improvisation and what does that look like? And here, let me just say a quick thing on recognition and the question of recognition from European countries for Morocco. I mean, it certainly signals, I think, a shift. And it's been the case for a while. It's not only a shift in position, but certainly a shift in approach. And I think for Morocco here, we see a case of kind of using gradual recognition, international and sort of growing international legitimacy and economic incentive to essentially unilaterally resolve or reframe a frozen conflict. The potential kind of internationally recognized and unilateral, what a multilateral resolution for which would look like is already established. But what we see Morocco doing is kind of reframing this issue and trying to sort of see a way to resolve it unilaterally that is acceptable and palatable to international actors. But I think right now the challenge for the EU and for the US and for anyone that's willing to take on this issue is really to figure out how to design a diplomatic engagement that also addresses the Sahrawi aspirations. And here I will kind of, pick up on what Hugh was saying, which is that we need a kind of diplomacy that focuses on making resolution much more attractive than the stalemate or status quo. And really, this can be achieved, as he mentioned, through some kind of economic benefits, local accountability, and also international legitimacy. And I think that's really where we are in this sort of moment, at least for the Western Sahara issue, and potentially also for other issues as well. You asked me specifically about migration partnership. Look, we can have a whole workshop just talking about migration dynamics. But of course, here is really, I think, an issue that really reflects both the promise, but also the pitfalls of EU diplomacy in North Africa. Of course, we've seen these very flawed deals that were struck with Tunisia and with Mauritania, and before those with Libya as well. But I think one of the things to kind of take away from those deals is that they work to the extent that they respond to both European needs and local priorities. There is a way in which these deals have really been kind of internalized and let's say owned and adopted by local actors for good and for bad, but as being very much kind of, you know, something that responds to a real need. So here I would just say, you know, when we are looking at an issue that is so political and so sort of fraught as migration, we really need to think about, what are the shared long-term goals? And I think right now, you know, we've sort of potentially, we can argue like these deals, yes, they address the local need, but they are still missing certain elements that will make them much more, let's say, sustainable and durable. For example, a more robust legal migration pathways, that's still missing. The sustainable economic development in the countries that are bearing the brunt of border policing, that's a piece that still needs to be worked on. There's still much more investment that could go into actually supporting institutional migration managements rather than just the policing aspect of it. So, you know, there's some sort of glimpses of what's been working, but I think there is a lot more engagement and support that is needed in order to make this sustainable and mutually beneficial.
Thank you so much for that. Again, very comprehensive, both at the macro and micro levels. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining in this important conversation where we, I think, tried to unpack the very many options and opportunities within the diplomatic toolbox. We don't appear to be on the verge of a diplomatic breakthrough on any of the conflicts in the Middle East for the time being, but certainly potential for lessons learned and what could come next in this steady process of diplomacy making. So important conversation to have, and thank you so much for your contributions across a range of tensions and contradictions plaguing the Middle East and the challenges ahead for European diplomacy. Thank you.